Okay, I think we'll get started. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. Welcome to our final exchange call of 2021. First and foremost, we could not do these without sponsorship, so a very special thank you to our sponsor for 2021, the Modern Miracle Network. A couple of quick housekeeping matters. First of all, we are going to let the chat function run today with the usual reminder that we will remove anyone posting rude or objectionable comments. The chat is for commentary and for networking. And I'm sorry for those. I always get emails right after these calls saying that I hate the chat. And the minute we don't run the chat, people email me and say, why is there no chat? So we are going to let it run. We're not able to silence it for you, unfortunately. So the Q&A box is for questions and talking directly to our moderator today, Andrew Lawton. So if you want to send a comment to him, to our moderator directly, please use that, not the chat discussion. We have a lot of questions come in before and we've discussed, so I'm not sure how much time we'll get to those from the audience, but certainly you can add to the conversation with Andrew. If you have suggestions on future topics, please connect through our website, or you can contact me directly, Troy at Canada Strong and Free Network. I'll ask Zoe to put my email into the chat function for all of you. Third, we're going to try a couple of live poll questions today during the call. So this is the first time we've ever done this, so please have patience. Hopefully it goes well. We haven't really even had a practice run with it, but hopefully it goes well. And then send a note in the chat or to me after and let me know what you think of it. Finally, this Zoom call will be recorded and posted to our website 2 hours after the call. And with that, I'm going to welcome our good friend, Andrew Lawton from True North, who is going to moderate our panel today. By the way, check out True North, check out all of the projects, the organizations that our great panelists are involved with. And I encourage the panelists to post any links that they want into the chat function. Follow them, support them, donate to their causes. We want to support each other in this cause that we're all involved with. And so with that, I will turn it over to Andrew, and thank you, Andrew, for moderating today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Although I hope the no rude and objectionable content rule doesn't extend to the moderator, because that's like half of what I had planned for today. Thanks very much, Troy. And I know everyone tuning in has taken time out of what is typically a very busy period of the year. So I want you to know you're in good hands. You've got 4 current and former radio people on this panel. And as all of us know, you've got to get out for news and traffic. So we will have this wrapped up at 1 o'clock Eastern. We're not going to keep you here for the duration of your prime Christmas shopping time on the the night before Christmas, or whatever we're at. So thank you very much, Troy, and Canada Strong and Free, and also to our panelists here who I want to introduce. We have Tasha Kheiriddin, who's a national political columnist with Post Media, also doing some great work over at Navigator. Danielle Smith, who has a fantastic newsletter, also at her work at the Alberta Enterprise Group, definitely needs to be acknowledged here. And Jamil Javani, who's with News Talk 1010, the iHeartRadio network, and the author of a fantastic book, Why Young Men. Thank you, all of you, for coming on. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, as we are at the end of 2021 and just at the cusp of 2022, we thought it would be a great opportunity to do both a backward look at the year we just came through, which I don't know, for some people might have stretched on a little bit, for other people may have just breezed by, we'll see. And also a look at the year ahead. Now, as we were planning this out, we learned that a lot of these things are very interconnected. A lot of the challenges that brought us through 2021 are certainly, it looks like, carrying into 2022. So I want to set the stage here by asking our panelists, first and foremost, what is it that they really brought from 2021 as far as not the most important story of the year, but the one that has the most meaning to them, and the one that needs the most discussion as we do this higher level analysis. Now, I'll start with you on that, Danielle. I mean, what was the story you were watching coming through 2021 and now looking back?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think we'll probably end up talking about COVID, but I don't want to get into a fight with the other panelists right off the hop. So we'll wait for a little bit to talk about COVID. The one I was watching, though, was to see whether the campaign against Alberta and Alberta's energy, the oil and gas industry, was going to amp up or amp down. And in fact, it looked to me like we dodged a bit of a bullet during the campaign. Alberta was not the issue. The big issue was COVID and the COVID response, not that we needed to shut down the fossil fuel industry. Unfortunately, with the Alberta referendum on equalization, it seems like Justin Trudeau's answer to Alberta was to appoint Stephen Guilbeault, who is the most anti-fossil fuel MP and activist that we probably have. So that's an unfinished story. I thought maybe we were getting to a point where we would have some common ground, where everybody would support each other in their aspirations to develop their own resources to the best of their ability and meet the net zero target in their own way. But 2022 will write the other part of that story.
Yeah, very much. And you touch on an aspect there that I think we should also drill down into, which is the general Conservative leadership issue, right?
The interesting part, and I think I may share a different view. I should probably mention that because I know that Erin O'Toole is having a few challenges with the internal party dissension, but I actually think that he managed that issue very well. And the proof in that to me was that it didn't become the main election issue. And part of the reason for that is I thought he took I didn't love his full policy on CO2 emissions, but I did love the fact that it didn't become a federal issue because he took it seriously and was doing something meaningful about it. When you say we can meet our target by using technology, by getting to net zero, by exporting LNG and displacing coal and getting credit for that, by looking at small modular nuclear reactors as an option to displace fossil fuels, by looking at ways that we can switch to carbon or to hydrogen and use carbon tech to capture and store carbon dioxide. Those to me are all very much in sync with the current Conservative message. And it seemed to diffuse the national media into thinking that he didn't have a plan. I remember watching Rosie Barton on CBC and she said, well, his plan isn't that much different than the Liberals. Next question. And I think that that's actually a victory for the Conservatives, that they've taken it off the table as a major issue.
And that actually ties into one of the poll questions we wanted to put to those of you tuning in. And I know we had to make some tweaks because the panelists were sad that originally they weren't allowed to put in their own responses on the poll. So I think we've sorted that out. Zoe Lynn's going to fire the first poll question of the call here, which is basically a predictive one. Will Erin O'Toole be the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada when we do this call in a year from now? Do you think he's going to survive the next year of his leadership? Yes or no? We'll have that up on the screen just for about a minute here, and then we'll come back to the results later on. But in the meantime, I want to go to you on this next, Tasha. Generally speaking, looking back to 2021, what's your big story that you're pulling out of the year?
Well, like Danielle, I don't want to dwell only on COVID because I think everything pretty much has got a COVID angle. But to me, one of the big stories, I thought the biggest one was the growing size of the federal debt and the spending that's been done to deal with COVID. I think that the reflex has been on the part of the Liberals that every time there is a resurgence or an issue, that they throw money at it and assume that that will help make the problem go away. I think in the initial stages of COVID, it was understandable. Nobody really knew what we were dealing with. So there was a sense of, okay, people have to stay home. They have to be, if they can't work securely, they need to have some kind of support so they don't go in and infect other people. As we've learned, though, the waves of this pandemic, and we're in the fifth of it now, kind of hard to believe, but here we are, that certain sectors are affected more than others. The idea of simply blanket support has really impacted many sectors very negatively. Whether it's the hospitality industry or the construction industry, finding people to work has become a real issue in some places because people's benefits on CERB were in some cases as much as they might earn in certain areas of the country. So that sort of distortion that happened, I think, was something that was not predicted. I think though, once it became clear that that was going on, the government could have acted differently. It could have targeted districts where you couldn't work safely. This is true. In some places, it's really impossible to do. But as a general rule, to simply say we're going to support everyone regardless doesn't make sense. I think that also the idea that just money can be rolled out ad infinitum is also a fallacy. We know at some point interest rates will rise, debt will have to be repaid, and that means taxes will go up. And the latest economic statement to me was incredibly one-sided. It was all about rolling out money. It was not any acknowledgement of how that would be recouped at any point. But at some point we will see that. I think the next budget might have some surprises in it. Definitely tax increases or taxes on banks, insurance companies. The government's been talking about that. The Liberals talked about that in the election. So, and those things will trickle down to everyone who uses those services. Make no mistake. So I think we're in for economically a very difficult time. And that to me is one of the biggest legacies of this pandemic, is the growth of spending. And the question will be how we rein that in.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that a lot of these issues were there before the pandemic. And I think the Liberal government has tried to use the pandemic as a bit of cover, which I think, as you note there, is not entirely fair. In the words of Jen Psaki, we will circle back to that in a moment, but I want to round out this first question with Jamil here. Just the big picture, high level, what's your story of 2021?
Thanks, Andrew. As Danielle mentioned, there's so much COVID stuff we could get into, but there's one point in particular I'd like to hone in on as far as my takeaway from this year. If you look back to this time in 2020, I'm a sports fan. Let's use that as an entry point here. If I was watching a basketball game, next to the Taco Bell logo and the Western Union logo, I would have seen the Black Lives Matter logo. NFL players, NHL players, MLB players kneeling during their national anthems. It was a very powerful movement a year ago. If you look through what occurred throughout 2021, we've seen the decline of this sort of race-focused social justice, let's call it that, movement. And I think that, I've been a keen observer as to the influence of this movement. Of course, there have been some policy victories on their part, including defunding police departments in the United States, leading to skyrocketing crime waves, for example. But for the most part, this movement has sort of waned throughout 2021. And I think my takeaway from this year is focused on why. Why has this movement waned, and what does this mean as we enter the new year? Well, I think what happened over the last 12 months is we realized that race cannot be a proxy for genuine class inequality. And that is what is happening in our society right now. 2021 saw a massive historic wealth transfer from the middle class to the tippy top wealthy elites, many of which do not even live in our country. Every small business that was closed put money in the pockets of Jeff Bezos, Walmart, Costco, you name it. And we even saw throughout the year people who were billionaires, people who are the most, who benefited the most from pandemic lockdowns, businesses being shut down. They're having races to see who can go to space now. I mean, this is the level of class inequality we've reached. And while this is all happening, in addition to the businesses being shut down, we also saw schools being closed. We know what that means for working middle class families, parents who aren't home because they've got to work 1.5, 2 jobs, kids who don't have the resources to get tutoring and extra help fell massively behind in their learning, in reading, writing, math. So this wealth transfer that's occurred has massive ripple effects moving forward. And I think what people realized is that the social justice movement, the Black Lives Matter style politics, doesn't capture this reality, doesn't have solutions to what's going on, and in many ways was silent or impotent in the face of these economic challenges. So to me, that's the biggest takeaway of this year, is that we are dealing with really serious economic inequality, really serious class issues, and we lack the political acumen and the language to actually talk about this and put solutions on the table.
That's quite a brilliant and astute observation there, Jamil. Thank you for that. And we will get back to that. We have 3 big ideas here that I want to delve into in a bit more detail. Let's go back, first and foremost, to Erin O'Toole's leadership here. And if we can actually get Troy on to share the results. I'm curious, before we hear what the panelists have to say about O'Toole's leadership, where you all tuning in thought this was going to go. The question was, do you think he's going to be the leader in a year from now? Troy, take it away.
Hey, well, Joe the cat and I have done all the counting here, gone through all the ballots. We had 72% voter turnout. 55% say that he will be leader 1 year from now. 45% say that he will not.
55 say he will, 45 say he will be not. Okay, now I should note the question was not should, it was will. Now people may have in their responses taken it different ways. Let me go to you on this, Tasha, because I know that obviously you are very, very keenly aware of some of these trends in the conservative movement, historic and contemporary, and also in the Conservative Party. If you're Aaron O'Toole, what do you take from a number like that, coming from, just a call of a cross section of conservatives with a small c across the country, that, about half of them think that you're going to be there in a year?
Well, I think it means you have work to do to get that 55 number up and the 45 down. And he knows that. There's no question. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting of various, dissensions within the party, within the caucus on issues, whether it was the party's position of the last election, whether it's been the actions taken against various MPs and other officials in the party who've spoken out against his leadership or spoken out against the direction the party has taken on issues. It's clear that he's got to fight. And he is fighting by, I think, pushing back, like I said, against people individually. That, of course, causes problems too. But I think one of the things he has to establish himself as is a strong leader with a clear vision. When I talk to MPs or candidates, actually mostly, who went door to door and didn't get elected during the last election in the Conservative Party, what the message they had was pretty much the same, is that at the door, people didn't know enough about him to support him or what he really stood for. And there was that confusion about the Conservative brand versus the leader too. That is something, again, that's also an issue. What is the Conservative brand? Aaron O'Toole tried to take it a different place. He tried to take it more to the center, but some people still in their minds couldn't make that bridge. And some people didn't want to, and they didn't like that. So he's got to, I think, create a brand identity that unites conservatives, but also be that brand identity. He has to walk the walk, so to speak, and there can't be any ambiguity. So, within the party, there are all sorts of people, talking different mechanisms of how would you force a leadership review. We know caucus could force one if they wanted to. The convention of the party is not supposed to happen until 2023. I'm not sure exactly if they would back that up or not, to 2022, but that's the only places really, I think, where you could force a situation. My concern, and I'll say it, is that people who don't get their way on this and don't force a review. We all saw this movie in Ontario with Patrick Brown, that people who were unhappy, and all of a sudden things came out in the media that forced him to leave. So I hope that cooler heads prevail in terms of having a review when it eventually does happen, and that people take their time and the leader takes his time to, like I said, to really do a self-examination of what the Conservative Party is and what it stands for and what it needs to do to go forward. And going back to what I said earlier, just really quickly, I think economics is their biggest strength. And I think they will have a lot to talk about in the next coming year, and they should focus on that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Tasha, I mean, in a lot of cases, this will be possibly a victory for Aaron O'Toole on technicality, and that there is no mechanism to get rid of him in the next 12 months. And in a minority parliament, I think a lot of people might be very leery of thrusting the Conservatives into a leadership review in 2023, when there is actually that mechanism that the party could use to get rid of him. But I mean, I don't want to obscure the point here that there is an issue in the conservative movement and in the Conservative Party, in that people are not in agreement. So let me go to you, Danielle, because I know you've always been a big proponent of unity, but I also think people are growing wary of that idea of just falling in line behind the leader, which is, I think, how unity is often perceived, or should I say calls for unity.
Well, and I think this is the challenge. If you dig a little deeper on issues, even the ones we've raised so far, you're not going to get consensus even among our conservative family. And that's a real problem when it comes to, I totally agree with Tasha, that you've got to chart out a vision. But what do you do when that vision doesn't have the same kind of support in Alberta as it does in Quebec? That, I think, is the fundamental challenge. What I would like to see is the federal Conservatives really start embracing this idea of decentralization and more autonomy for provinces and transferring tax points and assisting only those provinces who truly need it. I mean, I could support equalization if it applied to the small provinces to make sure that they had the same level of services that we have in Alberta and Quebec and Ontario and BC, but I can't continue supporting the system that we have right now. And so you're going to have to sacrifice some votes. Not everyone is going to agree with the vision. You've got to try to figure out a strong enough vision that is going to keep a country together, knowing that there are polar opposite ways that conservatism manifests in each of the provinces. I have my own ideas about what some of those other some of those other principles would be, but I'm just watching the chat and I see I'm not in the majority with a lot of people who are on there and talking about net zero. I'm sure that if we started talking about COVID, we would also end up with dramatically different ideas about how we should go forward. I kind of look down at the US and say, look at all those red states. Funny how they're able to chart a different path. And their Republicans are similar to our conservatives. Why are none of our conservative premiers able to chart that path? So there's a real problem that we have in navigating this through, is that I don't even know if conservatives know what conservatism means right now.
Yeah, I noticed there's a parallel exchange call going along in the chat, which is fine. We want it to be vibrant here. I will just note, if you have a question that you want to draw to my attention, make sure to use the Q&A feature because that is not scrolling as quickly as the chat feature there. Let me go to you on this, Jamil. I mean, the broader question was about Erin O'Toole's leadership, and I would ask a sub-question there, if I can, in that, do you think that the defenders of O'Toole are enthusiastic at this point, or do you think a lot of it is very begrudging, like, well, maybe he's not the best, but I don't want to go through the change again, and it's just more of a reluctant support?
I think a lot of the people who are supporting Erin O'Toole want to give him time. I think a lot of it is, people see that, with more time, they think that he'll figure this out, that he'll be able to bring the right people together, that he'll be able to represent the conservative movement in a way that is unifying enough to potentially win an election. So I think a lot of it is people believing he needs more time. Now, I think to Danielle's point about how unified we can be given different regional interests across Canada, I think this is why it's really key that we have different opinions welcomed within the conservative movement and opinions that can be expressed freely. This idea that everybody has to sort of toe the line, repeat the same talking points as if they're being supervised by an HR department, it's just not going to produce the kind of diversity in what we say as conservative movement members. It's not going to produce the kind of diversity that we see from members of parliament to make sure that everyone across the country feels adequately represented. We just saw in the United Kingdom, over 100 members of parliament publicly disagree, oppose what their Prime Minister Boris Johnson presented as far as responses to the Omicron variant. And the sky didn't fall. I mean, it's not the end of the world when people who share the same party have different opinions. And I think empowering people to articulate those views will go a long way for Erin O'Toole in being able to show that the Conservative Party can be a vehicle for the best interests of people with different priorities across the country. And I think I would just add to that, one of the things I'd like to see as well is just some commitment to being different, some commitment to being a genuine alternative to the Liberals, because we have seen, and over and over again, this idea that Conservatives can sort of play it safe, be as similar to a Liberal Party as possible, and hope that the Liberals lose without the Conservatives actually winning. And I just think that Erin O'Toole needs to run away from the people who are encouraging the National Conservative Party to behave that way. I think people want a genuine alternative, especially people like me. I grew up in a very liberal part of the country. I chose to be a conservative because I'm not a liberal. And the idea that you're going to win over voters like myself in places like the Toronto area by being just like the Liberals we chose deliberately not to support, it's a backwards political strategy, but unfortunately one that a lot of wealthy and well-connected people support.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamil. And that actually segues nicely into the point that Tasha brought earlier about the importance of the economy and economic issues. And one of the benefits of that is that that's typically an area where you have a bit more unanimity in the conservative movement. I think pretty much every conservative can agree on the importance of less regulation, lower taxes, and so on. It doesn't mean you won't find some people that are a bit more aggressive with that position, but is that enough? Because we've seen the Liberals win 3 elections in a row campaigning on a carbon tax, for example. So is that the tide that will raise all ships, Tasha?
I don't think it's, well, it is not the tide that will raise them alone. But here's the thing. I think to Jamil's point, I think there's room for dissension, obviously, and for different voices. You have to have that, and especially in a party like the Conservative Party, which is a party that's informed philosophically. It is not the Liberals, who are very pragmatic and for whom, power and being in power is the end game. I would like to see the Conservatives be the conscience of this government, though. That is not their role either. But the point is that, in the UK, the Conservatives are in government. So yeah, it's easier for them to disagree. They're there. Conservatives here are not there. And we were there, though. When I say the big we as in the movement party, were there. Stephen Harper's recipe for that was to focus on things that were centralizing to everyone, that were common to everyone. And what he did was focus on those and hammer away in a way that resonated with enough people to get the party into 3 successive governments. So what is that recipe now, today in 2020, almost 2, when things have, we've got COVID, we've got, as Danielle was talking about, issues around net zero. We've got a lot of things that were not discussed back in the earlier mid-2000s, the early teen 2000s. I think that the reality for the Conservatives is they have to find a way not to be the Liberals, but to get the voters that have voted Liberal, that chose to be Liberal. To Jamil's point, it's a choice. They have to understand that there's a better choice for them, because those voters in exurban and suburban Toronto are key. I hate to say it to all our friends out west, they are key to forming a majority government. If you don't get them, you're not in a majority government. And you're not going to get, Quebec's a whole other story with the bloc. We could talk about that forever. We will not. But the point is, Alberta and Quebec are not enough. You need to have Ontario. How do you get Ontario? You need to talk to new Canadians. You need to talk to the middle class that Jamil identified to, who might feel that, what's the security for me and my family? Where is this going? Economic issues, and not just economic issues, but economic opportunity, intergenerational opportunity for your kids to have a better life. That is what new Canadians come to this country for. My parents came for that. Other people's parents, like that is as a child of immigrants, that's what you're told you must succeed, and that's what you're here to do. Opportunity for that is what the Conservative Party is about, because it would not spend all your money on programs that just redistribute things and don't help people. It would not just willy-nilly decide to, okay, we're going to have, a big government intervention here, there, and everywhere, because we think we're the ones who know best. I think that's the emphasis the Conservative Party has to find. And it has to find a way to speak to that liberal audience, but not saying liberal things, because I think that there is an appetite for something different.
How do you do that, Danielle?
It seems to me that it should be easier to build a coalition at the federal level. The problem is we keep getting pulled into issues of provincial jurisdiction. Like, why is the federal government talking about healthcare and long-term care and pharmaceuticals and daycare? Those are all provincial policy areas. And I think that's part of maybe the Liberal tactic and the NDP tactic, is that they bait us into talking about issues at the federal level that our default answer is, well, that's not really our jurisdiction, that we need to leave that to the provinces. And so we've got to figure out a way to navigate that appropriately, because I think it always continues to be a bit of a punching bag. But the other thing I think that Erin O'Toole was really strong on, I'm not sure why he's relented on this. You probably saw the stories that they were talking about bringing back the China committee, and he chose not to do that for at least 18 months. And that's, I think, a short-term reaction to the fact that it wasn't communicated well, and it alienated Chinese voters in the Toronto area. That's some of the analysis I've seen. Those who live in the Toronto area will have to tell me whether or not that's true. But maybe he needs to decouple that idea with something aspirational for Canada, that we need to be self-sufficient in a lot of key materials. We can't be in a situation where we're reliant on China for rare earth minerals. Why is China coming in and buying up lithium deposits? And nobody blinks an eye about that. If we're going to be talking about some of these strategic resources, which are really going to be foundational to the tech industry. Why isn't Canada asserting itself in developing those resources? Why aren't we saying that we need to have a manufacturing base so that we aren't reliant on China for a lot of those materials, or whoever? Maybe you decouple it from China, but this notion of being aspirational, self-sufficient in key development of resources and manufacturing, I think that that's something that can unify the country. And then you can go to each different province and be able to celebrate something in each country rather than what we have right now, which is one region getting pitted against each other. So I think there's a message there that we can pursue. And I think there's an appetite to pursue it as we watch how shaky the supply chain has become.
If I could just jump in for a sec, sorry, I think that I really agree with Danielle about the resources piece as something that is key to sort of aspirational visions for Canada. I wouldn't say necessarily go domestic, though. I think one of the big things that we have in Canada that we have not really pushed forward is the fact that when you look at the green energy market or the desire for green energy around the world, we have the ability to contribute to that in such a major way. Whether it's deposits in the Ring of Fire, cobalt, nickel, you've got all the materials for EVs. We've seen what's happening in the States. And in terms of the Buy American proposals, well, Canada needs to stand up and say, hey, you know what? We can help the world achieve this. We have a vision. Conservatives could really be all over this one. And I know Rob Ford is already sort of all over in Ontario, but federally, it is a unifying thing. Alberta is a resource economy. Quebec is a hydroelectric economy. Ontario has, this huge mining capability. BC has mining. I mean, we have resources that we could tap, and we are a resource producing country. Let's be honest. It is one of our calling cards and strengths, and we should be proud of that, as opposed to saying we're just going to have a transformational economy or a retail economy or, the tech economy of the future. Tech is fabulous. It is wonderful, but we cannot forget also one of the things of our history, which is still something that is very alive today and that we could promote.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity here as well. If we go back to the bigger question of how conservatives advance a fundamentally conservative message that resonates people, you brought up a point earlier, Jamil, about class inequality. I mean, when we hear inequality brought up in a Canadian political context, it's always from the NDP, almost maybe the Liberals every now and then, but almost always from the NDP, and always just in the sort of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tax the rich soundbites. We don't hear anyone actually delving into this issue and offering a concrete solution. So do you think there is an opening for the Conservatives here? And we had a question from Saul in the Q&A. I mean, what would the policy prescription you'd advocate on that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there are a few things. So one is, if we want to address generational inequality and the impact that the pandemic has had, we should be really looking at, reformatting the way school policy works at the provincial level. I think that the federal government has put forward some money, which is usually how the Trudeau Liberals respond to problems, is putting forward money that would pay for extra tutoring and academic supports for kids who have fallen behind. And I think at a provincial level, there are other decisions that we can make, including doing needs assessments, making sure that the way school boards operate is flexible and malleable enough to address the needs of kids who, as I said, have fallen behind months, if not years, from grade level when it comes to some key academic subjects. So that's one policy area when we want to take a long-term view of how we address inequality. It's making sure that kids get a fair start in life in the education system. And I think that's got to be a conservative bedrock. When we should be people who are going around saying equality of opportunity means who your parents are and where you grow up should not determine the kind of math education you're going to get or the level of instruction you'll receive in reading and writing. So I think, to me, that's a foundational element to addressing the issue. Now, on a bigger sense, when it comes to economic policy, I think a lot of communities are looking for support when it comes to entrepreneurship, starting businesses. We take for granted, I think, people who may be already aware of how business operations work, who already maybe have started their own business or know people who have. But folks in this country who are not exposed to what entrepreneurship looks like, I think do need a hand up in understanding what opportunities are out there and how to grow in our economy. What are the opportunities that Canada offers? And I think these are things that I've advised the government of Ontario on. I know that Premier Jason Kenney is very passionate about as well in Alberta. And my hope is that this would be something conservatives really hone in on, which is where is there opportunity for us to show people what entrepreneurship can do for their families, do for their communities, and taking a keen look at the kind of supports that people need. One example I would give is, Ryerson University has a number of incubation programs that are specifically designed for young entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs from minority communities. They've done a fantastic job of providing the kind of mentors and resources needed for people to achieve some of the economic development needed in neighborhoods that are struggling in the Toronto area. So there are practical examples on a community level of what people can do to really grow their self-dependence, become stronger, not necessarily need government programs, but might need a start in order to get things moving. And I think those are the sorts of policies that I would encourage us to look at right now. And then one last thing that I'll throw out there is, when we get to this topic of how do we talk about economic issues, and are we defining conservatism simply based on that? Obviously, I mean, I've just imagined, based on the number of people who are hearing my voice right now, there are other issues, including social and cultural issues, that motivate people to become conservatives. And I think there are ways of connecting the dots here that are worth thinking about. So when we talk about home ownership, for example, and affordable housing, well, part of that, and this maybe gets to some of the socially conservative concerns that people have, is, housing affordability is also about being able to raise a family, being able to have kids, being able to pass on your values to the next generation, live out your values based on your faith. If you don't have a house, if you don't have the ability to raise kids because the economic situation you're in is so precarious, it affects the social and cultural concerns that many conservatives have as well. We don't connect those dots. I mean, we just had an election. I don't think I heard a single moment where a conservative running for office was talking about the social and cultural implications of housing and affordability. But as a 34-year-old millennial, that is at the top of my list, both economically and as a social and cultural issue. And I think we can do a better job of connecting the dots for people.
No, that's very, very well said, Jamil. And I know originally we were going to take a look back and a look forward. And I think it's very good that instead of dwelling on the past, so many of our looks back have actually brought us into the forward-looking part of this discussion. So let's keep going with this here, because I know that when we were all chatting yesterday, one of the big thoughts that came up was about how there could be some big changes coming in the next year. We've got Jason Kenney going through a leadership review in April in Edmonton. We've got an Ontario election. Now, these are two premiers, two conservative premiers that I think are not necessarily on safe ground here, on solid footing. I don't know if you want to go into this from an analytical or a predictive perspective, Danielle, but just looking ahead, I mean, what's the story to watch here in terms of the provinces specifically, not the federal conservatives?
I just want to bridge it by talking about what Jamil was speaking of there, because I agree he has touched on all the issues that are so important and that we should be able to message on in a conservative way that allows us to win. The problem is when we talk about that at the federal level, then it's always some big, massive federal program with a bunch of central planners, hiring a bunch of bureaucrats who use unionized employees, and that's the only answer. And the reason I'm saying that is because I fear that's what this daycare program is going to turn into. I've already heard in Alberta that we were so excited to get the $3.8 billion, but private operators are being told you're not allowed to expand. We're going to control what you're allowed to charge. And so are we heading in that direction? Is that the problem? Is that really what conservatism is that we just take the money and run and then just hand it over to the bureaucrats, and then the bureaucrats design the same old types of programs that they designed under the NDP or the Liberals or some progressives? Like, why can't we support families directly by using this as an opportunity to create a voucher style system for daycare, so that we deposit money into the account of somebody so that they can take it and they can use it at a central daycare, or they can use it at a family day home, or they can ask their grandma or their neighbor or their sister or someone from their church to provide the childcare. Like, we should be able to create a support for these type of programs in a way that's consistent with conservative values, free enterprise principles, principles of choice, principles of supporting families, principles of supporting communities and churches. And we don't. We always default to saying what we'll do is we'll just focus on the economy, generate a bunch of money, and then hand it off to the same old guys who are going to build these programs in the same old way, hiring a bunch of people who are going to vote for the NDP. So a little bit of a rant there, but you get my point, is that we have the ability to embrace the issue and do it in a different way, a compassionate way, in a way that makes sense. And so to bridge to the issue of the provinces, that's where I feel all of our conservative premiers are failing. None of them have read Preston Manning's book, Do Something, to say that our job is not to be liberal light. Our job is not to figure out a way to be better central planners. Our job is to find a way to deliver on the programs that families need and people want and communities need for support, but do it in a conservative way based on free enterprise values. And I think if we had, whether it's Jason Kenney or Premier Ford, commenting and painting a vision along those lines, they might be able to win back some of the support that they've lost. I don't really believe that Premier Kenney's issues in Alberta are just around his COVID response. His COVID response has been pretty well identical to Scott Moe's COVID response. And Scott Moe is at the top of the polls in popularity. Jason Kenney's at the bottom of the polls in popularity. I just think that we haven't really charted out how we would be all that much different from the other guys. And that's what we need to do.
Let me put that to you, Tasha. Do you think that the pandemic is the big problem for the premier, Sarah? Do you think there is a bigger issue there?
Well, I think a pandemic's a problem because it exposed a lack of coherence and stupidity, frankly. You know, when Jason Kenney said the stampede, pre-stampede, COVID's done, like have a great summer. I mean, what a stupid thing to say. I'll just say it right out. Stupid thing to say. It wasn't done. Anyone could see it wasn't done. And these kinds of pronouncements, Doug Ford made some of these here too, you know, say, oh, we're not going to bring in restrictions. And then 2 days later, oh, we're bringing in restrictions. It's this waffle back and forth and making pronouncements that have really no basis in reality that frustrate people. And the pandemic's exposed that, because I know, I mean, in Ontario, we already had an issue in terms of the Ford government, you know, doing one thing and then walking it back. This was before the pandemic. But I mean, I understand, obviously, the pandemic, you know, things change on the drop of a hat. Omicron, for example, has totally ruined everyone's Christmas. There's the Grinch who stole Christmas again, and no one was expecting this. And the speed with which this is tearing through, you know, and infecting people is unexpected and shocking, quite frankly. I mean, I know personally many people who are now sick that, you know, it's like in the last week and boom, it's something new, and politicians have to deal with that. I understand it. But that's why conservatives actually, you know, are supposed to be more prudent. They're supposed to not go out and make the big, bold, revolutionary statements or whatnot without real foundation. They're supposed to take things slower and be, you know, more oriented towards what worked before, towards tradition, towards ideas that are incremental, if you will. I mean, Stephen Harper was a very incremental prime minister, for example, in the way he approached change. So I think that is something that both of those premiers are grappling with. It exposed this kind of weather vaneness. And I think that in Ontario, though, I've seen polling that we've done at Navigator, Doug Ford's not in that much trouble. So I don't know, maybe it's different. I mean, from what I understand, it's different in Alberta with Jason Kenney and his prospects for re-election. But that's also a function of the opposition here, you know, in Ontario, and not to delve into the local politics, but you don't have alternatives that are, you know, jumping off the page at people going, I would do a better job. So I think, though, for conservatives, a lesson of the pandemic is that, you know, we need to manage this in a way that shows people that the science is being taken seriously, but that decisions are not being made on the back of a napkin. And until you do that, you're going to have this sort of confusion. Then people just don't follow the rules because they think, well, they change anyway and they don't help. So it's very frustrating.
Let's go to you on this, Jamil, because I know you have been fairly critical of the Ontario government's approach. What do you make of this, and you know how it will affect Doug Ford's political fortunes? But in general, I mean, the auditing of government policy and the government's approach to this right now.
Yeah, you know, I think it's one thing to accept policy outcomes that we may not like, right? You know, I'm not a supporter of vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, for example. Don't think it's good policy. I've seen the tremendous impact in a negative way that it's had on already marginalized families that I have been working with for most of my life and living with for most of my life. So I come from a perspective of being very critical of those sorts of policies, but I see the argument in favor of those policies. I understand why someone would come to the conclusion that they are necessary, and I'm willing to accept differences in outcomes. I think that's a natural part of being in a democracy. Where I'm critical more than outcomes is on process. And the reality is this: Growing up, when I, was reading Orwell in university, I was, taught to think that state-run media is bad, right? We see examples from communism. We see examples around the world of when governments are overly involved in the sort of information you get from the media. That's not what we have in Canada. In fact, I think we have the opposite problem. We have media-run state. We have policy process being informed by an influence that news media corporations have at a very bizarre level. These are private companies that produce information, spread information around our country, and they have a tremendous amount of influence over the decisions that politicians and bureaucrats make. And a clear example of that from Ontario is the scientific director of the Ontario COVID-19 science table. For months has been going and doing media interviews, pushing for the kind of actions we're seeing now in response to Omicron. He knew that if he went to the media, they would project, promote, amplify the policy recommendations he was behind. And now we're in a position where the media has set that up as the expectation. And it takes a certain type of government leader. It takes a certain kind of grit. It takes a certain kind of confidence and strength to be able to withstand the media turmoil and stay focused on a different vision. I don't begrudge people for not being able to survive that sort of pressure. It's very difficult. I can only imagine, having not even been an elected official, what that would be like. But to me, that is a big part of the problem we have here, is we have too much of a media-driven policy process, and that makes it hard for people to accept the outcomes. It's one thing to say, I disagree with policy outcomes, but I can live with it. It's another when you feel those outcomes are, to some degree, illegitimate because of the media-driven process that they come from.
I want to disagree on that.
Before you do,
Yeah.
Tasha, I want to get our next poll question in here, which touches on these issues, and that is, in 2022, will conservative ideas and prescriptions be ascendant or remain in the wilderness? And I would note here, we're talking about small c conservatives. So a lot of the ideas that have been put forward by Danielle and Jamil and Tasha here, not necessarily conservative platform prescriptions, but we'll put that poll up for just a minute. And now disagree away, Tasha.
Okay, I was going to say, the media does, of course, present information, but a lot of people are getting their information not in the legacy media at all. They're getting it off Facebook. They're getting it on websites where there is no fact checking. They're getting it on all sorts of conspiracy places. I mean, they're getting it everywhere. We actually are swimming in information and misinformation from all sources. And I don't think, the Ontario Science Table, just to say, they actually have predictions they haven't released. There's stuff that's way worse than that's actually out there. I know people who work in the government, and it would just curl your hair. And they don't want to scare the public. They are presenting the fact. If you read the last report that they put out, it's quite clear, Omicron is incredibly infectious. And it's not a question of, we're going to have millions of people dropping dead in the streets. No one's ever said that about COVID. It's more, the problem is if too many people get sick at one time, they all go to the ER. And then people who need treatment, who need surgery, who need other things, they're already canceling surgeries in Toronto because they're anticipating they won't be able to handle, they won't have the critical care beds if something goes wrong to put you in ICU. And that's because it's just going to be too many people sick at once. It's just numbers. And so, I don't think it's alarmist for the media to report on what Steiner is saying in Ontario. I don't think so at all. I think that, in fact, it's people, like you say, people have to make choices on their own and not be told by the government what to do. Well, look at that information and make choices. So the government doesn't have to say, only 10 people at Christmas. Say, okay, I'm not going to have more than 5 people at my dinner table, my choice, right? But people don't make those choices. And it is an incredibly frustrating dance between the respective freedoms versus the fact that you're going to have a system where people are not going to get life-saving care. And it's well documented. People have died because not of COVID, it's because they couldn't get the care they needed. And the hospital system couldn't handle it. And yeah, we should have more private healthcare. We can have that conversation too. But the reality is, in 2 years of COVID, you're not going to build that capacity, right?
I'll get your response to this, Jamil, and then we'll go to Danielle after.
Yeah, look, we can sort of play a game of I know people, you know people. The reality is that Premier Doug Ford has said openly during press conferences that his decision-making is trapped in a box in part by what the public health bureaucrats put forward and by what the media reports on. That is public information. You can find it yourself. So
yeah, but that's what he's saying, because he doesn't want to wear it either. I mean, this is the
you're
thing
just
too.
you're
It's
speculating about
politicization of it.
no, you're speculating about his intentions and his motivation for why he said what he said. All I'm saying is you can point to all the insiders you know. Let's just look at what we know is publicly available for everyone listening to us to go and find themselves. Not everyone has the relationships you or I have with people in government. We should not expect the audience listening to make their assessments based on your insider knowledge or my insider knowledge.
No, but the point you're making,
hang on here. I want to get out of the weeds on this here.
Look at the public information.
I do feel this
Which
is
is
important,
awful.
and I want to bring Danielle into this, because I feel that the point that's been raised here touches on a challenge that I know you've spoken about, which is that a lot of the times the communication around these issues has been abysmal, and what the government says we shouldn't do one day, 2 days later they say we should do. So how do you break through that, and how do you make it so it doesn't look like we're being denied the information that is available to governments, like Tasha mentioned is happening in Ontario, or conversely, like we're actually getting a science-based approach here?
Here's the problem is we're not going to heal the conservative movement until we've managed to move into an endemic treatment of COVID, because you can just see from the discussion so far that we are so divided on this issue. I blame mostly the politicians on this, though, because there is a communication challenge. I think that 30% of people are terrified. I think 30% of people are prepared to move on. And I think 40% are waiting to get some leadership on which direction we can go. And how different would things be if, looking at the Alberta data, is if people knew that 70% of the new cases that we have in Alberta right now that are active are people who are double vaccinated. Like, if we knew that information, then why in the world would we have vaccine passports and firing the unvaxxed and segregation? That I think we've got some misinformation there. They wanted people to get vaccinated, and so they lied to the public. And the public is under the impression that if you get double vaxxed, you can't get this disease. Well, if that was the case, why are we getting triple doses? Why are we talking about 4 doses? So there needs to be some honest communication on the part of the politicians. Second thing is, look at that data that came out of BC. Someone posted it on one of my locals pages saying, I'm surprised BC would admit this. What if every day that we announce COVID deaths, we also announced the number of deaths by suicide and fentanyl overdose and the ages of those kids who are dying of suicide and fentanyl overdose and despair? I think it might cause people to realize that we have a secondary mental health crisis that's going on. And that's the thing that the politicians have to start balancing. And I guess the third thing I'd say is I just would love for us to be honest about who is most at risk. Like, a 5-year-old is not at risk of dying of COVID. Let's just be straight about that. An 80-year-old with multiple pre-existing conditions living in a long-term care facility is. And so you need to have a targeted approach to protect that 80-year-old in a long-term care facility that's different than a 5-year-old. And I think that communication responsibility lies with the premiers, because they're the principal communicator. And I don't think any of them are making those points. And that's what I find distressing about it all.
Yeah, I don't think they're making those points either. I will say, though, it's not about deaths. Everyone focuses on deaths and risk. It's about keeping people out of the hospital system. That's really what it's numbers and keeping people. And that's what vaccinations do. Yeah, you'll get sick. We'll probably all get sick at some point with COVID. It's a reality, whether you're double vaccinated or triple or not. But the point is, you won't necessarily be in the ER. So,
and it's true,
politicians
Tasha,
should be honest about that.
And
I'll
just say, because Alberta does all of these statistics, and I just looked at them this weekend, you will see that the most people who are still getting hospitalized are over the age of 60 with multiple pre-existing conditions, whether they're vaxxed or unvaxxed. And so we have to have a targeted approach to those over age 60 is all I would say.
One thing I would bring up here, and I think this is a very important discourse to show. I'll say discourse because it's more positive, because the conservative answer is not always as clear here. And I think the panelists have all brought that up, that Tasha, you were talking earlier about tradition and prudence. And unfortunately, that's not universally shared. There's also a large contingent that takes the very libertarian approach on this. And I think Danielle's point that the conservative movement can't necessarily move forward unless it agrees what the conservative solution is here is quite a valid one. Let's bring in Troy, because we did that poll result, or that poll question that looked at basically, do we think that small c conservative values will be ascendant in the year ahead? What are the results there, Troy?
We had 60% vote, 37% say ascendant, 63% say remain in the wilderness. So a bit of a
Ooh.
pessimistic.
So we're ending the
Not
year
good.
with a bit of pessimism. Okay, that's an unfortunate reality of our time here. But let's try to put a bit of an optimistic spin on it here. Let's go around and make a big bold prediction for 2022. It can be on anything, but we'll start with you, Jamil. What do you think or perhaps hope is going to be in the year ahead?
Well, what I hope, and I think we saw the beginnings of this throughout 2021, is that conservatives, both in the partisan sense, but also in the small C movement sense, will really see that they can be champions of free speech in this country. The left, liberals, leftists have abandoned those values. For younger generations, Zoomers and millennials, I think this is going to be one of the issues that really have promise for connecting with young Canadians, is saying, we're going to prioritize making policy that will be viewed through a filter of free speech, free expression, free thought. I think this is a really strong opportunity for conservatives. We saw it with the bills that were targeting censoring YouTube, giving the government more regulatory power over big tech platforms that a lot of young people use, not even just for entertainment or information. Some of them even use it for a job. I mean, there are many successful Canadian YouTubers and others who make money off Instagram as influencers. This is a business that these are business platforms that for a lot of young Canadians. And I think conservatives can really show a commitment to those values, and also show that they're going to make policy with these young Canadians in mind. So that is my optimistic hope for next year, that not all of our conservative values might be ascending, but that might be one of them that we can really rally behind and get excited about.
And Jamil brings the hopeful message. That's just what we need here. We'll go to you next on this, Tasha. What's your prediction for 2022?
Well, I think Jamil has an excellent point in terms of issues that will appeal to people. I think another one for the conservatives, and I go back to what we talked about originally, is the fact that pessimistically, I don't think the economic situation will be great this year. I, however, do think that the conservatives need to be the voice of reason and reining in spending and saying enough is enough. We've got to find a different way to deal with the pandemic rather than throwing money at it, as we have been doing, or the Liberals have been doing. And it's not just simply the growth of spending for the pandemic, but big government that has grown as a result, and the acceptance of government. One of the reasons the Liberals were reelected, we did polling at Navigator and research post-election, was that people liked the money they got. And this is why the Liberals are keeping rolling it out, because that was what got them back in office. But we know that when you look at the numbers of people who voted Conservative versus Liberal, it's a distribution factor. They're not that far apart, but they are concentrated in parts of the country where the Liberals are able to get a lot of seats. So the Conservatives have to figure that out. I'm optimistic that a strong economic message will resonate where it needs to resonate, particularly in Ontario, and hopefully will raise the Conservative vote.
Thank you for that, Tasha. And we'll give you the last word on this, Danielle.
Well, I said ascendant because governments are bankrupt at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level. We've reached the practical limit of what they can actually do. And what does that mean? It means that community and families and individuals and free enterprise, we're going to have to do the heavy lifting to solve problems in the future. We're going to have to develop new models for delivering healthcare that are outside of the monopolized Alberta healthcare services. We're going to have to find ways to take care of ourselves and look online for all of the ways that we can keep ourselves healthy, because heavens knows we haven't been getting that message from officialdom. I've been amazed by just how much has popped up on the technology space in Alberta. So I've met this group of young people who are all in their 30s and 40s. They're tech investors. They don't want a single thing from government. They're working together, building community, making little investments, seeing these wonderful little companies grow into something big over 3 or 5 years, and then repeat and start again. So I think that free enterprise is going to prevail next year, because I think it's the only mechanism that is actually going to work. And that means that those of us who are doing well, we're just going to have to support our local charities, because the good work in communities is going to take place through the nonprofits and the charities. I'm losing faith that government can actually get anything done. I wouldn't give them one more red cent until they can start making better use of the money that they've got right now. And I suspect we're going to see more Canadians say the same.
Thank you for that. Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, also podcaster, newsletter writer, host of the News Forum, many, many different hats there. We appreciate you joining. Tasha Kheiriddin, national political columnist for Post Media, and also doing great work over at Navigator. And Jamil Javani, author and broadcaster over at News Talk 1010 and on the iHeartRadio network. I'm Andrew Lawton. I made one prediction, which is that we'd be out at 1 p.m. on the dot, which I appear to have lived up to. So we'll hand it back to you, Troy.
Thank you so much. Daniel, your tech example of folks reminds me of our friend Grover Norquist in the States, who says the coalition is not a conservative coalition. It's a coalition of people that just want to be left alone. And I've always thought that's a clever way to frame the broader movement, the coalition of people who want to be left alone. So with that, thank you to our panelists for an excellent discussion. Again, this exchange call, we'll post it to our website and our YouTube page inside the next 2 hours. Again, a special thank you to our sponsor all of this year, Modern Miracle Network. Thank you so much. With that, I want to wish everyone, your families, a very Merry Christmas from wherever you're joining us in this country. We're blessed to be in this country. We are the Canada Strong and Free Network. If you appreciate and value the work we do, please consider a donation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in 2021, and we will see you again next year. Bye for now.